in this interpretation based on Thucydides between the leading military power Sparta and the rising power Athens, and that was the basis for the Peloponnesian War, which ended up destroying both countries, by the way. That's the tragedy. Neither Sparta nor Athens won the Peloponnesian Wars. Sparta did technically, but it was soon disappeared from the map. These wars are negative sum wars. So an example of a rising power through convergence is Germany's economic rise from 1870 to 1914. And you can see that according to the same data of Angus Madison, that Germany crosses the UK GDP actually around 1905, and war ensues around 1914. Of course, I won't get into all the debates and complexities of World War I, except to say it was a tragedy of great powers. Each of the powers felt extremely vulnerable to the others, and especially Germany, France, UK, and the Habsburg Empire. Well, we're in a similar situation now. According to the International Monetary Fund, China overtook the United States in total output in 2011. These are GDP measured at purchasing power prices, not at market exchange rates. So that's just important as a technical matter. But it means that China is now the larger economy. I say, well, what do you expect? China has 4 times the population of the United States. Of course, it's going to be a larger economy, except if China remains perennially poor. Technically, if China remains at less than 1/4 the per capita income of the United States. But why should that be? China is enormously productive, creative, innovative, hardworking. The education system is excellent. So why wouldn't China rise in relative economic terms? And of course they have, and now it's a larger power. As Mearsheimer predicted uncannily in 2002, he said this will lead to the onset of hostility. I have to say, he was right. I was certainly wrong, because I've been engaged with China for 40 years now. Many of my students are senior officials in China. Many are academics in China. And I could never imagine that we would have these tensions, because China is not a threat to the world. Only in our newspapers is it a threat to the world. Now our newspapers are hysterically pointing out that it is a threat to the world. By the way, I'm convinced by people who have never been to China, these pundits, so-called. In general, as you get older, it's harder to read newspapers in general. Stop me before I become vulgar. But what Mearsheimer said came true. As China got bigger, per se, China became an enemy. And a couple of days ago, the US Congress held hearings on China's threat. Now, I guarantee those people, they probably don't even have a passport, those congressmen. They know nothing, because I know them. So I'm just giving you a hint. But Mearsheimer's right. Threat, counter-threat, escalation of rhetoric, daily columns about the coming war, and sure enough, you have tragedy. So this is what convergence is bringing. Incidentally, the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are now larger than the G7 countries. This is rather remarkable. To my mind, great, because it means economic convergence taking place. It means a narrowing of the gap. It means that the strange divergence of the industrial era from roughly 1750, I'll say, until 1950, which produced the North Atlantic-led world, is over. Good. Why should the North Atlantic, with 10% of the world population, lead the world? That was obviously an artificial aspect. James Watt came up with a great invention. The North Atlantic developed on the basis of that. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but the basic idea is that one small part of the world should not morally and ethically dominate the rest. And the mechanics of domination don't exist. But with this convergence comes tension and new forms of war. So let me just put a moment of game theory here to say that the great power politics, the tragedy of the great power politics, is, in my view, well depicted by the famous prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma, of course, is the game theory concept developed in 1950 of how in a social dilemma in which two parties can either cooperate or cheat, even though cooperation is mutually beneficial, they end up cheating. And that's a tragedy because both end up worse off. The way it works, if you're not familiar with the prisoner's dilemma, is in this matrix, the well-being or metric of well-being for the first player, the rose, which is the US in this illustration, is the first number in each quadrant. So if both the US and Russia de-escalate, each side gets 5. But if the US de-escalates and Russia escalates, the US loses big time. It's, in other words, like a unilateral disarmament, and the other side doesn't disarm and wins the geopolitical prize. So the US loses 10, but Russia gains 10 if the US is, quote, foolish enough to de-escalate while Russia escalates. And the idea of the prisoner's dilemma is straightforward. If Russia, which is the columns in this matrix, de-escalates, the US says, well, if we de-escalate, we get 5. But if we escalate, we get 10. So if Russia de-escalates, we should escalate, because then we get the advantage. What about if Russia escalates? Well, if we de-escalate, disaster, we get -10. But if we also escalate, not good, but not as bad as de-escalating, -5. So whatever Russia does, our best strategy is to escalate. This is the so